Morning. How is everyone here this morning? That good, huh? Maybe everyone here was running a marathon and you're just all so tired now that you just don't have any energy left to speak. We are going to be in Genesis chapter 22 this morning. Does anyone, I know maybe one of you might. Where is he? He's gone. One of you might know who this is. Do anyone know who the band The Who is? Yeah, oh, you do, right. Well, you know, they were a band mostly before your guys' time. But they had this one song that they sang, and the title was Who Are You? Anyone heard that song? Kind of goes, who are you? Who, right? Who are you? I really want to know. Have you ever been asked that question? Who are you? I really want to know. Because often people ask you that question, right? And they ask you who you are, but they actually don't really want to know who you are. Or maybe even yourself. Do you ever ask yourself that question about who you are? And do you really want to know who you are? Because often maybe we don't really want to know deep down who we are. Maybe we suspect we might not like it so much, what we might find down there. Or maybe we don't ask it because we think, well, we've got it all worked out and I know who I am and I don't need to dig any deeper. But how do you even know who you are? Who are you? One of my favorite film franchises is about that whole question about who you are, or who Jason Bourne is, right? You may remember, if you haven't, remember the story that Jason Bourne's like this secret agent, right? And he's found floating in the sea, and he's fished out onto a boat, and he has amnesia. He doesn't really know who he is, but bit by bit, it kind of comes back. You know, he discovers this bank account, a safety deposit box, and he goes in, opens it, and he finds a load of money and all these different passports and that. And a gun, of course. And later on, he's with this woman called Marie, and they go to a restaurant. And in this scene, he's just kind of talking over with her about what he's found and what it says about his identity.
I'm not making this up. These are real. Who has a safety deposit box full of money and 6 passports and a gun? Who has a bank account number in their hip? I come in here, and the first thing I'm doing is I'm catching the sight lines and looking for an exit.
I see the exit sign too. I'm not worried. I mean, you were shot. People do all kinds of weird and amazing stuff when they're scared.
I can tell you the license plate numbers of all 6 cars outside. I can tell you that our waitress is left-handed and the guy sitting up at the counter weighs 215 pounds and knows how to handle himself. I know the best place to look for a gun is the cab of the gray truck outside. And at this altitude, I can run flat out for a half mile before my hands start shaking. Now, why would I know that? How can I know that and not know who I am?
How could I know that and not know who I am? Because we know a lot of stuff today, don't we, right? We know all kinds of facts and figures and all kinds about this and about that, but do we really know who we are? Because it seems to me like a lot of that information really obfuscates our identity. It kind of hides our identity. And hopefully this morning, you're not suffering from amnesia, and you don't have a safety deposit box full of like loads of passports, and if you do, you probably just want to keep that to yourself. But if we open up the vault of our lives, the chances are we're probably going to find quite a few identities hidden away back down underneath there. How do we see ourselves? Do we want to know? Well, this morning, hopefully, we do want to know, right? And we're going to use God's word to help us see that. We're in this series called God Questions, and in this series, we're looking at questions that God asks various people in the Bible. And this morning, we're going to look at an occasion where God asks man about his identity. He asks him, "What is your name?" It's a simple question, right? And yet it really goes to the heart of his identity. Genesis chapter 32 we're in, and we're going to read verse 22 through 32. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him as he passed through Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. How was your name chosen, and why? Parents, oftentimes they want to honor a relative, right? And so your Christian name, first name, is chosen because it's passed down from like your grandfather or grandmother or whatever else it might be, right? Maybe that's how you came to have your Christian name, first name, sorry. And that's how I got my Christian name. My grandfather was called Bryan, although he spelt it with an I, not with a Y. Most people think that's spelt with a Y, an I rather. Occasionally somebody asks and says, "Wow," and that's always funny. And Bryan, though, is, I believe, Irish, but I'm not Irish. In fact, as far as I know, I don't have a drop of Irish blood in me. So there is a disconnect there between my name and where it comes from. Because often parents, right, pick names just based on whether it sounds like a good name or not, Scroll through the list of baby names until you get to one that you like and you think it'll kind of fit, but there's no real connection between the name or the past or anything else. But when God asks Jacob about his name, he isn't just asking about his name, like, what name shall I put on your coffee? He's asking about who he is. Are there any Jacobs here this morning? Okay, that's good. Because it's a popular name still, right? And some people name their kids a certain name because they hope that they will live up to that name. There's a meaning behind that name, right? Like with Bryan, I guess it means strong and virtuous, right? But you're not going to name your kid Jacob and hope that he lives up to that name. Because the name Jacob means he takes by the heels, or he cheats. You probably don't want your kid living up to that name, do you? I've also seen it translated as deceiver or supplanter. And of course, that's what Jacob did, didn't he? He cheated his brother Esau out of his father's blessing. In fact, Esau bitterly remarked, he said, is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. Jacob lives up to his name. It's who he is. That's what he is about. And yet, of course, that's not his whole identity either, though, is it? Because he has this different identity also going on in him, and that is this identity that he gets from God, this promise that God has made to him. It came through the blessing that his father Isaac gave to him. Even if it had been obtained deceitfully, it was still his promise. And these 2 identities are kind of wrestling within Jacob, aren't they? And the question is, which one of them is going to kind of prevail? It's kind of the motive of Jacob's life, isn't it? He's always striving, always wrestling, always striving. But for what? And it all comes to a head one night in the middle of the wilderness, in the dark where he's left alone. And I suspect that whatever name we may or may not go by, that we have this kind of wrestling going on inside of us quite often, right? These different identities that are vying in us. And the question is, as they wrestle and we wrestle with them, which one is going to come out on top? Which one is going to be dominant? And so what I want to do this morning is kind of unpack where Jacob got his identities from, and how the winner came out on top. And maybe, hopefully, we can identify with some of that as we look at Jacob's story. And the first identity he had was an inherited identity. So God has called Jacob back home. He's been away for a long, long time. But now he's actually standing on the border of his homeland. And God meets him and asks Jacob, what is your name? Because tied up in that question is his inherited identity, which he is about to come face to face with. You know, we just talked about Christian names, first names, but how about surnames, last names, right? How many of you chose your surname, your last name? Oh, nobody. Imagine that. You did? Well, okay. Thanks, Janelle. Okay, if you got married, maybe you did choose, well, but you still didn't really choose the name, though, did you? That still just came with the package. Because those names get passed down too, don't they? They're an inherited name. Sometimes they're passed down from generations, right? You can trace your family tree back, maybe some of you hundreds of years. Maybe that was your identity for a long time. I know when I went to school, we were always called by our surnames, not only by the teachers, but pupils too. We called each other by our surnames. That was our identity. And some of you have middle names too, perhaps. And you didn't choose those either, right? You might not use them very much to identify yourself, but you have them there, right? The only time the middle name's ever really used is when your mum and dad got upset with you, right? And then suddenly they used both names and you knew you were in trouble, weren't they? At least it was in my case. But those are all inherited identities. And we have more inherited identities. Where were you born? I bet you didn't choose where you were born, did you? Where did you grow up? You didn't choose that probably either. The city, the country, these all things, right, that play an important part into who you are. The language you speak, the region you lived in, your nationality. You didn't choose that either. Maybe later you had an opportunity, maybe later you moved and you chose that, but initially you did not. You have a geographical identity. And it plays a big part, right, in who you are. Even if you've moved away, even if you've lived away from where you were born for a long, long time, it still plays a big part in your identity. It can still tug on your heartstrings. Jacob had lived away for 21 years, and then God called him back to the land of Canaan. And more than that, we have other identities too, right? We have physical identities that we have inherited. The color of our skin, our ethnicity. And yes, whether we're male or female. We don't get to choose that. That's something that we inherit. We have no say in those things, and that is a massive part, isn't it, of who we are. It's how we identify ourselves and to one another. Now, sometimes we might not like the identity that we've inherited so much, right? We wish that we were taller, or we wish that we were shorter, or wish we were this, or we wish we were that, that our health was better. But these things can't be changed. It's what we're given. And we might struggle with them, and we might try and cover them over with different identities, but they still remain fundamental to who we are. They are the basis of who we are. And if you try and take them away, confusion reigns, right? Which is kind of a little bit what we see in our culture at the moment. You can't take those identities away and be able to properly identify yourself or those around you. And then we have other identities that we've inherited that are kind of lurking at the bottom of our safety deposit box, if you like. And maybe we don't even realize it. We just kind of pull those identities out from time to time, but we don't realize that we're kind of doing that. They're not rooted in science or genetics like those other ones are, but they're inherited from like family traditions and rituals. And we inherit them and we think they're just like normal, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but when I grew up in my family, I thought everyone was like us. And it's kind of a shock to realize that other families are not like your family. Maybe you realize that particularly like, when you get married, that's the first time you really, it's a shock, isn't it, right? Christmas is coming along and, it'll be that time you go and choose the tree, right? What do you mean you use a fake tree? How could you do that? What do you mean you open presents on Christmas Eve? How could you do that, right? I'm not trying to offend anybody if you use fake trees or open your presents on Christmas Eve, but you might want to really think about that. I don't know if Jacob used a fake tree or not, but I know that he inherited some stuff in his family, like favoritism, for one. His brother Esau and him, they grew up in a home, didn't they, where there was just rampant favoritism. His mother, Rebecca, wanted Jacob to come out on top, where his father, Isaac, wanted Esau to come out on top. And they used those two brothers against each other, basically. Pitted their children against each other. And neither of them really knew what it was like to inherit an identity where they were loved and accepted just for the people that they were. They didn't know that. They didn't have that. They came from this terrible kind of parenting family dynamics, didn't they? I bet they longed just to be loved for who they were, to be accepted for who they were. And the trouble with that stuff is that when you inherit that kind of stuff in your family, that dysfunction, right, guess what happens? It just gets passed on down. Because that's what happened with Jacob, right? He goes off and he marries these two sisters, and you didn't have to guess which one of them was favorite, did you? And then as he returns back, he has 11 children that he brings with him, and you didn't have to guess which one of his children was favorite either. Because these traits, these things are just passed on down through the generations. You know, oftentimes as a pastor, I've talked to people, listened to people with their stories of brokenness, you know. And pretty much if you start asking about the story of where they came from, guess what? It's the same thing that gets passed on down. And they didn't ask for that. They didn't ask him to inherit all that stuff. It was just kind of given to them. Of course, the flip side is that we can think that what we've inherited makes us it, right? that we're superior to everyone else because of what I have inherited, because I come from the right family, because I speak the right language, because I have the right passport, because I have the right upbringing, the right religion, the right denomination, you name it. We can think that we are completely safe because of our inherited identity. That's kind of what the descendants of Jacob ended up thinking, isn't it? That they thought, oh, well, you know, because we can trace our lineage all the way back through Jacob and Isaac, all the way back to Abraham, we're safe, right? We have this incredible inherited identity, and nothing can take that away from us. And we can think the same thing. Well, I can trace my family tree all the way back to the pilgrims who landed here, and they've all gone to church, and I've gone to church, and I'm an American, or I'm a Brit, or whatever it may be, and I have this inherited identity, and it can never be taken away. Except before Jesus started his ministry, and his cousin John was out baptizing in the Jordan River, and tons of people were coming to be baptized, and then some Pharisees and Sadducees turned up, and John had some words for them. He warned them, do not presume to say to yourselves that we have Abraham as our father, for I tell you, God is able even from these stones to raise up children for Abraham. Even now the axe is laid to the root of the tree. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. What is your inherited identity? And how does it affect the way that you see yourself and who you are? Secondly, we have an obtained identity. Jacob, he returns to Canaan, and he has, this big family, he has lots of possessions and servants, and yet he just set out, 21 years ago, he left Canaan, and he had just a staff. But now he has all this stuff. He's wealthy with his flocks and his servants and his wives, servants and children. Sometimes I kind of resonate a little bit with Jacob, not that I have anything like the amount of stuff he has, fortunately. But occasionally when I go back to England, I think about how the Lord has blessed me in this country. Because basically I came here with a suitcase, right? And I said as I go on a plane going back to England, and I certainly don't take all that stuff back with me, but, and I think about how I have a wife and kids and grandkids and stuff, and it's all pretty amazing, frankly. But all that plays into our identity, doesn't it? All the stuff that we obtain. I go back now as a husband, as a father, as a grandfather. I never had those identities when I left. Obtained it all here. Because when we launch out into life, we start to acquire other identities, don't we? And some of those that we pursue and we want to get, and others just kind of get put on us without asking. Because after someone asks you what your name is, what is the second guaranteed question that comes along? Exactly. What do you do? That's the biggest question, isn't it? And we tell them what we do, you know, our trade or our profession. And as we do that, we're really kind of identifying ourselves, aren't we? And we're not just telling people what we do, because with what we do comes with a load of other stuff too, doesn't it? That tells other people about our identity. It tells them about our education. It tells them about our earnings, right? It tells them about our social status. It has all kinds of things tied up in that. What do you do? You know, Jacob's way of obtaining things, well, it wasn't really very good to start with, was it? Because he obtained his brother's birthright, you know, by trading it for a bowl of stew. It wasn't a good deal for Esau. But then he stole his brother's blessing, you know, and he was deceitful over it. Again, he did that with food. And Jacob was constantly striving to try to obtain identity, wasn't he? He struggled. When he went to Haran, when he ran away from his brother, the first thing he did, he got to a well, and what did he do? He used his physical force to take the stone away from the well so that Rachel could water the flock of sheep and goats there. And then he came up against his uncle, who was even trickier than he was, and tricked him into not just spending 7 years to work for free to get Rachel, but for another 7 years, right? Because he put Leah in there first. And then he had to work for another 7 years after that to build up his own flock. And I wonder with Jacob if he didn't feel like he had to constantly try and prove himself. Constantly try to prove himself, because he was kind of living with this stolen identity, wasn't he? He had this identity, you know, this promise of God, but he's like, well, it's not really mine, you know, and so I could, you know, and any moment now I'm going to be found out. You ever feel like that? That kind of imposter syndrome? You've built up this identity, but you're like frightened, you know, unless you keep going and keep driving, that at any moment someone's going to suss you out. And then all is going to be revealed for the fraud that you really are. And so often that becomes because we're just trying to overcome those inherited identities that we're carrying around with us. And I know this firsthand, by the way, because I come from a family where my dad didn't receive blessing when he was growing up. And he didn't receive blessing when he was growing up because of favoritism. And he wasn't the favorite. And because he didn't receive blessing when he was growing up, he didn't really know how to pass that down to his children. That's not to say he wasn't a good dad, because he was. And yet, you know, as a child, you want to feel your dad's blessing, right? As a son, you do. And when that's not forthcoming, guess what you do? You go looking for that in other places. And for me, myself, I found that in work. Because I found that when my boss would give me those blessings, or customers, or whatever it was, or the standard of living, and so you keep striving and keep working to trying to get that identity. But really, there's only one person you want to hear it from. And you know it's kind of a facade. And ultimately, you know, we're all living with stolen identities, aren't we? Because the identity that we stole is God's. We're all pretending to be gods of our own lives. And so we struggle and we strive to obtain things. And we forget that God just wants to give it to us, you know. I think of this wrestling that Jacob has, and it always strikes me that, you know, God had already given him this blessing. And yet Jacob continually strives and struggles to get it. And aren't we like that so often. We forget that God just has given it to us. But no, we have to fight on, right? And there's other ways, of course, that we obtain identity, right? Whether we're married or whether we're single, other achievements, right outside this morning, people are trying to gain a certain identity by running 26.2 miles, right? So that they can put that on their list of accomplishments, and that becomes part of their identity too. And travel and experience and sports, both what we play and who we support, the brands of clothes and everything else that we buy, all comes down to the fact that we're trying to obtain an identity for ourselves. We want to be noticed. We want to belong. Of course, that only works, right, as long as other people do notice and see that we're the celebrity that we're trying to be, because sometimes we don't notice other people around us, right? A couple of weeks ago, we went to McCormick and Schmidt's for it's my birthday, so we don't usually go there. But we were waiting to be seated, right? And there was this tall guy, and a couple of his friends came in, and seemed like a lot of the staff seemed to know him, and like they were coming up and saying hello to him. I just assumed like he'd worked there or something. And it was Leslie that pointed out that actually he plays for the Blazers. Jermaine Grant, is that right? Yeah, that's who it was, yeah. So he was like standing right next to us, and I don't know who you are. Because what's the point of acquiring all those identities if nobody, some muppet standing next to you doesn't even recognize you, right? Or what happens if you don't have the opportunities to acquire those identities? But fortunately, it's all right, isn't it? Because what Jesus tells us is that we're not actually out to acquire identities according to the world. Jesus, when he launched his ministry, he gave what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And when he talked about obtaining identities, he actually talked about some very different identities, didn't he? In fact, the first three that he talked about are, he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Because they're very, very different identities, aren't they, to what most of us are trying to obtain and fight and struggle to acquire. Not many of us really, when it comes down to us, really want those ones that Jesus is offering. And yet those are the identities we need to have. So what will bring us really to wanting those kinds of identities that Jesus offers? Well, it's an identity crisis, isn't it? Jacob has this identity crisis that God has told him to go home, but what is waiting for him there at home? I mean, he's kind of had to go home because he's built up his flocks, but his uncle Laban, his cousins, they're kind of upset because they've seen Jacob get wealthy, right? And they've become jealous, and they're thinking, well, maybe we need to do something about this. And so Jacob had to go home. And yet, who is waiting for him at home? Well, Esau, his brother, who the last time Jacob knew, hated him so much that he was just waiting for his mum and dad to die so he could finish Jacob off as well, right? And now Esau is coming to meet him with 400 of his servants. And so he goes out in the desert and he wrestles with this mysterious man who turns out to be God. Who is Jacob? And where does he get his identity from? Because that often takes a crisis in our lives, doesn't it? Where we're forced to wrestle with who we think we are. You know, maybe some of you in college or what have you did that Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. Nobody? Oh, you're so lucky. Oh, yeah, Jeremy did. Yeah. Well, fortunately for you, I'm not going to go into all that this morning. But basically, what he talks about is there are stages in life transitions, right, where we kind of have to struggle with our identities and shifting from one space to another. Like, maybe you're in college and then you leave college and you're no longer a student, and suddenly you're going out into the big wide world. And who am I now, and what am I supposed to be doing? And there's lots of stages of life that this happens, right? When you get married, for instance, when you have kids, when you lose a job, when you retire, when you have a relational breakup, when you move across the country or the world. Who am I now? How do I identify myself? There's been a lot of talk, I guess, the last few years about deconstruction of religion and deconstruction of faith. And a lot of that comes about, right, because we have faith and we have religion that we've inherited from our families. And then maybe we've even added on top of that, right? We've gone to church, we've gone to Sunday school, we've gone to youth groups and maybe some children's camps and youth camps, right? And we've obtained this idea of what it is to have life with God. And then we go out into the big wide world, or some crisis comes along, and then we start to go, well, what is all this exactly? How am I relating to God, and how does God relate to me? And I think for myself, that is kind of a little bit of my history. I grew up in a kind of liturgical church, and it was very much like, well, you go to church and you take communion, and the liturgy, and I love the liturgy, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying anything against all this stuff, but it was all like rituals, right? And then for myself, it's like, well, how does this relate in my life? And the answer, of course, was, well, it didn't really relate in my life. And so I shoved it all aside. And I shoved it aside for a while until some crisis in my life, and then started to look to see where God was in all of that. And it was that part that forced me then to kind of deconstruct some of the stuff that I'd grown up with in church, right? Because my thought was, well, I've done some stuff in my life which is not that great, but exactly how many times do I need to go to church to put that right? How much communion do I need to take before I will be forgiven? And it was deconstructing those elements of faith that brought me to true faith. That it's only through Jesus Christ. It's only through belief in him. Nothing else matters. It's like, the Matt Redman song, right? I'm coming back to the heart of worship. Because it's all about Jesus and nothing else. And what Jesus has done on the cross for us. And Jesus' resurrection from the grave. And do we believe that? Not in all this other peripheral stuff. Not that, the liturgy and all of that's all great, but that all comes after the very essence of belief in Jesus Christ. And we can wrestle with that question. We should wrestle with that question, right? God wants us to wrestle with that question, bless you, because that is the very essence of our faith. And you know what? God can take it. He can take us wrestling with him. That's why he went and met Jacob, right? He could wrestle even with Jacob, that maybe one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. Because Jacob, he wrestled with God all through the night. He hung on, didn't he? Even when God dicked him in his hip. He still managed to hang on. God can take it. But sometimes we try and appease God, don't we? When it comes to our identity, and we appease those around us. I think of Jacob, and he'd sent, he heard that Esau was coming, and he sent like all these gifts on to Esau, right? To try and like appease him, like, don't come and take my identity away from me. But God isn't interested in any of that. God came straight to Jacob and wrestled with him. And obviously that takes a crisis to bring that about before we're even willing to go to that place and wrestle with God. Jesus told that story about two sons, and the younger son decided that he wanted his inheritance, and remarkably enough, his father gave it to him, and he went off into a far country, and he wasted it away on whatever he wasted it away on, trying to find different identities, right? He didn't like his inherited identity, and so he went off to try and obtain a different one. But he ended up in what? He ended up in crisis. There was a famine, and there was this Jewish boy, and he was feeding pigs, and the pigs had more to eat than he did. And as he wrestled with all of that, he thought, I could go back to my father's house, not as his son, but as his servant, because his servants, they live far better than I do right now. And so that's what he did, didn't he? He trotted off back to his father's house. And he kind of rehearsed this speech as he went along, this is what I'm going to say to my dad when I get there, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, but, if you'll just take me back as your servant, that would be fantastic. But before he got there, right, his father saw him and came running out to greet him. And his son got his speech out, but his father wasn't listening. He didn't care. He wrapped his arms around him and kissed him and told his servants to bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put on a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And that's the identity that God wants to give us this morning. Identity found through his son, Jesus Christ. He's just waiting to do that for you and for me this morning. But sometimes it takes a crisis in our lives before we're willing to go and get it. Which brings us to our last identity, which is our new identity. So Jacob, he wrestles with God and he hangs on through the night, and God touches him deeply, right? He has this permanent reminder of how he has wrestled with God. He's never going to forget this night, because every time he walks, he limps, and that's going to be a reminder for him. And God gives him this blessing, and God renames him Israel. God rules. God heals. Or it could actually reflect just Jacob's assertiveness and his insistent desire to get a blessing from God. How much do you want your new identity from God? How much do you want to be blessed by God? How willing are you to fight and wrestle and hang on to your blessing from God? I'm not really suggesting that we go out and offer God a fight. That's not what I'm saying here. And we receive his name through his grace alone, right? I'm not saying that we can wrestle our new identity out of God. We receive it through the gift of Jesus Christ, who has wrestled on our behalf on the cross, and wrestled and killed off our sin. But like Jacob, right, we're given this promise, we're given this new land, we're given this new life, this new identity, but we're going to have to wrestle a bit, not only to get it, but to keep it as well. It's interesting to me that Jacob actually didn't use his new name, Israel, until quite some time afterwards, in fact. He's, the next chapter he's still called Jacob, and the next chapter after that he's still called Jacob. It's not until some time after that he actually starts using his new name. Sometimes it takes some wrestling, doesn't it, for us to work out our new identity in Jesus Christ. I think Paul says, for us to work out our salvation in fear and trembling. We have to be willing to do that. But he also says that he who began a good work in us will bring it to completion. In other words, we won't lose our identity. Jesus told his disciples to seek, to ask, to knock. In other words, to do what? To wrestle for God's kingdom, right? To come into your life. To wrestle for God's kingdom to come into the life of our community. To fight tenaciously for that new name to be established in us and to grow. Because what does that new name give us? Well, it gives us access to the very throne of God, for starters, doesn't it? It gives us forgiveness. It gives us a future. It gives us a hope. Even in crisis, it can give us peace. We will never lose that identity. In the book of Revelation, Jesus addressed 7 churches. And one of the churches that he addressed was the church in Philadelphia. No, not on the East Coast, but in Turkey as it is today. And it's one of only 2 churches that Jesus actually commended in Revelation. And it was a small church. It wasn't a powerful church, but it was a faithful church. And it was a church that kept his word. It kept his name. It kept Jesus' identity. Because they were determined that now that they'd been given this new identity, they were not going to lose it. They were going to fight for it. They were going to wrestle for it. Because that was who they were now. And that was what they were going to be as well. And Jesus told the church in Philadelphia, "I'm coming soon. Hold fast what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it. And I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." In other words, Jesus is saying, hang on to that new identity, right? Wrestle for it, both individually and collectively as a church. So who are you this morning? And do you really want to know? What is your identity this morning? Where do you get it from? How does it affect the way that you see yourself? How does it affect the way that you see the world around you? And most important of all, when God asks you that question, who are you? How will you answer?